talked about several examples of different types of verb phrases in English. We have seen that the most common type of verb phrase that we find in English is what we call the monotransitive verb phrase. That means exactly the same thing as a transitive verb phrase. In other words, it's comprised of a verb group plus the direct object. After thinking about the monotransitives, we talked a little bit about examples where we seem to have nothing appearing after the verb group. In other words, the only thing within the predicate is just the verb group. That type of verb phrase we called intransitive. And the third type of predicate that we looked at was one in which we have not only a direct object, but we have as well an indirect object. So something like John gave the book to Mary. John gave is going to be the verb group of the sentence. The book is the thing that was given, so it's the direct object. To Mary is the indirect object. She receives the book. So the indirect object always is the recipient of the direct object. Notice that when you have a ditransitive verb group, you always have the possibility of having the other order. So you could have always said, John gave the book to Mary. You can say it as John gave Mary the book. But the meaning is still the same. It still means that Mary is the recipient of the book and that the book is the thing that is changing hands. So whichever way you decide to say a ditransitive sentence, it is always made up of verb group, noun phrase, direct object, and then the indirect object, which can be a prepositional phrase with to or for, or which can be a noun phrase. I gave Mary the book. Mary is the indirect object. Okay, so let's finish up talking about the different types of verb phrases that we have, and probably in terms of what you're most likely to find, you would next in line after the ditransitives have what we call an intensive verb phrase. So an intensive verb phrase is what we have, for example, in a sentence like Mary felt ill. So when you have the sentence Mary felt ill, Mary felt ill. We know that the subject of the sentence, the thing that the sentence is about, is Mary. So Mary is the person who we're speaking about, who we're giving information about. And notice that Mary is followed by what we would expect the predicate of the sentence. So that is felt ill. And what is happening within this predicate? That is the question that we're asking about all of the different types of verb phrases that we see in English. And with this one, it's interesting, if you think about it, Mary felt ill. What is ill doing? Ill is describing Mary, right? We're saying that Mary was ill. She was feeling ill. She was undergoing the experience of being ill. So ill necessarily is of what syntactic category? Adjective. Why? Because it's modifying a noun. So this is an adjective phrase, ill. But what about felt? We know that felt is the verb group of the sentence. So that's going to be, and that's the only word that's in the verb group because we don't have any auxiliary verbs here. So notice that when you have this item appearing after the verb group that is telling you information about the subject, this is what we call a subject complement. A subject complement is an item that appears after the verb group in the sentence, and it describes the subject. It gives you information about the subject. In this sentence, our subject complement happens to be an adjective phrase. However, we could have had something different. So when you have an intensive verb group, you have a couple of different possibilities in terms of the structure. You can have verb group plus subject complement. the subject complement is an adjective phrase. Mary felt ill. Mary was ill. Whenever you see the verb to be in any of its form, be, was, is, were, etc., you're always going to think that perhaps you have an intransitive verb group, because that's the verb that occurs most commonly in the intransitive type of structure. So that's a tip-off that you want to ask yourself first, okay, is this intensive? What else can we have, though? You could say something like, John is an engineer. Notice that when you say John is an engineer, our subject is John, right, occurring initially. It's what the sentence is about. Is our complete verb group. That's the only material that occurs within the verb group because it's the only verb in the sentence. So this is our verb group. And then what is the role of an engineer? Think about what an engineer is doing in this sentence in terms of the meaning. It's describing John. It's telling you something about John, that he has the position of being an engineer. So in other words, even though we know an engineer must be a noun phrase, how do we know that? We know that because it's made up of a determiner, and the noun, engineer. So anything that is made up of determiner plus a noun is always a noun phrase. So the idea is that in this sentence, this noun phrase is serving as a modifier of John. Even though typically we see adjectives playing that role in the subject predicate type of sentence. So a subject complement is also called a subject predicative, and that means exactly the same thing. So we're going to abbreviate that as SC. And what all of these guys have in common is that they're giving you information about the subject of the sentence, although they can do it in different ways, in other words, with different types of phrases. So as another example of what you might have, so the second type would be where you have the subject complement being a noun phrase. What if you had something like Mirza is in the kitchen, for example? So what's going on with this sentence? Well, we know that in its most basic parts, it's divided up into subject and predicate. The subject of this sentence, the person we're talking about, is this individual Mirza. So this is the subject of our sentence. We know that it can be the subject because it is a noun phrase. How do we know for sure that it's a noun phrase? We know because we could replace it with, for example, a pronoun. You could say he is in the kitchen. So your subject is Mirza, everything else must be your predicate. So is in the kitchen is your predicate. And then think about what your predicate is comprised of. It's comprised of your verb group plus what else? Well, let's see, your verb group is going to here be just the verb is. That's the only verb that you have in the sentence. So that's the whole verb group. In the kitchen, what's going on here? You have in as a preposition, the as a determiner, kitchen as a noun. You know that the determiner the is telling you about kitchen. It's specifying a particular kitchen. So the kitchen is forming a noun phrase. And then we have this preposition in that is forming a unit with the kitchen. It was in what? It was in the kitchen. So we say that we have a prepositional phrase here, in the kitchen, and in the kitchen is describing what? The being? That doesn't seem to really make sense according to the meaning of the sentence. The intuition is that in the kitchen is telling us information about Mirza. So in this sentence, in the kitchen is functioning as a subject predicative or a subject complement, which we're going to use that notation most of the time in this class, subject complement. Therefore, you have an intensive verb phrase. So notice that you have three different types of intensive verb phrases. You can have an intensive verb phrase that is made up of a a verb group plus an adjective phrase, a verb group plus a noun phrase, a verb group plus a prepositional phrase. And just like direct objects, there will always only be one of them in a sentence at most. You will never have more than one subject complement. You will never have more than one indirect object. So all of the grammatical relations that we're talking about, all of these complements to the verb, occur only in a singular form. In other words, there can be only one of them per sentence. We'll never have two. So let's look at another example of this type of sentence where we have a meaning that something is giving you information about the subject of the sentence. What if you have something like, Paula is tired. Paula is tired. So who are we talking about? We're talking about Paula. What are we saying about her? We're saying that she is tired. So Paula, subject of our sentence, is tired. The rest of the sentence, in other words, predicate of our sentence. Therefore, we know it's going to be comprised of verb group plus the complements of the verb phrase. So our verb group here is just the verb is. That's all we have. How do we know that tired is not a verb? Because look, it has the ed at the end, right? And remember when we were talking about syntactic categories, we said, how do we know that we're dealing with a verb as opposed to something else? We said that the verb can always appear in past tense or in different tenses, in future tense, in present tense. And any other type of word cannot appear in a tense. So it looks like tired is in the verbal form because you get this ed past tense. However, if you thought about it, you would then ask yourself the following question. Well, is it the case that really what is being described here is an action of being tired? In other words, this is described an event that happened in the past. No, actually, Paula is tired is telling you about something that's ongoing, that's happening right now. So in other words, the tense of the sentence is not past tense at all. It's not telling you about something from before. It's telling you about something happening right now, which comes from the fact that is the main verb of this sentence. But if is the main verb, then what can tired be? And when we think about it, Paula is tired. Tired is not describing an event that Paula participates in. It's just telling you information about Paula. It's modifying Paula. So tired in this particular example is an adjective phrase because it's comprised of an adjective. It's an adjective because it's modifying a nominal. And the role that it has, the grammatical relation that it has, is as a subject complement. What if you have, instead of Paula is tired, have a sentence like, the robbers were arrested. The robbers were arrested. It looks very similar to, on the surface, the structure that you have with Paula is tired. So we want to compare these two and see if they're actually the same. Well, your subject is going to be the robbers. That's who the sentence is about. And then what's going on? After that, we have our predicate comprised of were. And then what about arrested? Arrested looks like another one of those things that could be a verb because it has ed at the end. It looks like it's appearing in the past tense. However, we just saw with tired that was misleading, that actually tired, although it doesn't end in ed, is not the past tense of a verb, but is actually a modifier of Paula. So we want to ask that same question about this example. The robbers were arrested. Is it the case that when we say that, arrested is modifying the robbers? So is it the case that the robbers were arrested? Arrested functions not to talking about an event that happened in the past, but just to tell you about a stated being of the robbers. And if we ask that question, we could think, well, actually, if somebody were to say the robbers were arrested, what would you know? You would know that someone arrested the robbers. So in other words, you actually are describing an event that happened in the past, which was this event of arresting. So in this sentence, were arrested is the verb group, and the main verb of this verb group is arrested. So we say we have the verb group divided up into main verb, and this guy is going to be our auxiliary verb. So what type of verb phrase is this going to be? Well, if we look after our predicate, after our verb here, we don't have any complements, right? There are no complements to the verb. You cannot say the robbers were arrested Bill or something like that. You can say the robbers were arrested by Bill, but then you have a prepositional phrase. So it's something completely different. If you tried to put something here as a direct object, it would not work. So it looks like this is an example of an intransitive verb phrase. Intransitive because there is no complement to the verb here. Whereas when you have Paula is tired, structurally on the surface it looks the same. However, you see that tired is functioning as a modifier of Paula, and therefore you have an intensive verb phrase as opposed to an intransitive verb phrase. So let's think a little bit about the final example of what we're going to have for our verb types, which is a prepositional verb phrase. So, what would be an example like that? When you have a sentence like, John glanced at the book. John glanced at the book. Our subject is going to be John. Our verb group is only comprised of glanced. We have no helping verbs, no auxiliary verbs. And what's going on after the verb? Well, we have this at the book, which we know is a prepositional phrase. Why? Because at is a preposition, the is a determiner, and book is a noun. So together these form a noun phrase, which is the complement of the preposition at. So at the book must be itself a prepositional phrase. So notice that in this case, we couldn't have just said John glanced the book. If you just left the preposition out, John glanced the book, it wouldn't be a possible way to say the sentence. You would understand what the meaning would be. What would be intended would be John glanced at the book. But we can't say it that way. We need to say the preposition at, and therefore we call this type of prepositional phrase a prepositional complement. So a prepositional complement is a prepositional phrase that occurs after certain verbs in English that require something that has something like the meaning of a direct object, but it cannot be a direct object because we don't have a noun phrase. We have a prepositional phrase. So there are not so many of these in English. If you look at the text where they talk about the prepositional verb phrases, you're going to see that there are not really very many. So if you familiarize yourself with the 4 or 5 prepositional verbs that we have in English, such as glance, you'll be already prepared to know automatically, very quickly, which are the prepositional verb groups, and therefore which are the prepositional verb phrases. So prepositional verb phrases comprised of verb group plus prepositional complement. In other words, it's required by the verb, but it must be in the form of a prepositional phrase. Okay, we're going to come back and talk a little bit about how to provide the internal structure of these examples by looking at phrases. So this is what we'll continue with next time. Thank you.